December 27, 1941. Vågsøy Island, Norway. 07:48 hours. The German garrison is having breakfast when the darkness explodes. British commandos pour through windows and doors like a flood of controlled violence. No preliminary bombardment, no warning shots. Just sudden, overwhelming presence where moments before there was nothing. Hauptmann Werner Klimt drops his coffee cup. It shatters on the floor, the sound lost beneath gunfire, and reaches for his weapon. But the British soldier already has a knife to his throat. The message in the commando's eyes is clear. You were dead before you knew we were here. This is December 1941. Germany controls Europe from the Atlantic to Moscow. The Wehrmacht is considered the world's finest military machine. Disciplined, professional, technologically superior. In Berlin, the High Command tracks the Eastern Front's progress with confidence. In occupied territories, German soldiers sleep soundly, protected by the greatest army ever assembled. Yet in this frozen Norwegian fishing town, that certainty dies with the morning light. The commandos aren't just attacking a garrison. They're attacking something deeper, the psychological foundation of German military superiority. They're proving that no position is secure, no victory is permanent, and the nightmare can arrive without warning at any moment. To understand how the commandos became Germany's nightmare, you must first understand the context of 1940, the year Britain stood alone. After Dunkirk, the mathematical reality was crushing. The Wehrmacht possessed 156 divisions. Britain had perhaps 12 combat-ready divisions on home soil. Germany controlled 3,000 tanks across Europe. Britain scraped together 200. The Luftwaffe numbered 3,500 combat aircraft. The RAF had survived the Battle of Britain but was exhausted, depleted, hanging on through willpower and desperation. In this context of overwhelming German superiority, Winston Churchill demanded something impossible: offensive action. Not someday, when armies were rebuilt and America joined the war. Now, immediately, strike back while the world still believed Britain was fighting. The concept emerged from desperation and innovation combined. The Commandos. Small elite units trained to attack where the enemy felt invulnerable, not to hold territory. Britain couldn't hold anything in 1940, but to shatter the psychological certainty that Germany was untouchable. The German military mindset, forged through Poland, France, and Norway, was built on systematic superiority. Superior training, superior equipment, superior tactics, all coordinated through superior planning. The Wehrmacht won because it was better at industrial-scale warfare than anyone else. Soldiers from Berlin to the Atlantic coast believed this absolutely. German propaganda reinforced this confidence relentlessly. Newsreels showed endless victories. Radio broadcasts mocked British weakness. Soldiers in occupied France and Norway received mail from home describing life in a nation that had conquered a continent in 18 months. The psychological message was clear. Germany is invincible. Resistance is futile. The new order is inevitable. Into this environment of absolute German confidence, the commandos were designed as psychological poison, not through propaganda or counter-messaging, but through visceral demonstration. Show German soldiers they're not safe. Prove their defenses can be penetrated. Demonstrate that the invincible Wehrmacht can be killed in their beds without warning. At Achnacarry in the Scottish Highlands, the training doctrine was revolutionary. Don't train soldiers to fight. Train them to haunt. Teach them to materialize from darkness, strike with overwhelming violence, and vanish before reinforcements arrive. Make them understand that their weapon isn't firepower. It's the creeping certainty in the enemy's mind that safety is an illusion. The Germans called their empire Festung Europa, Fortress Europe. The commandos' mission was to prove that fortresses have cracks and nightmares slip through cracks. The transformation from ordinary soldiers to living nightmares required breaking and reforging human psychology. Corporal Thomas MacDonald, former factory worker from Glasgow, writes home in August 1940, "Mom, the training here isn't like regular army. Yesterday they fired machine guns over our heads while we crawled through mud. Real bullets, not blanks. 3 men ahead of me panicked and stood up. The instructors didn't stop firing. Those men are gone now, sent back to regular units. The message is clear. Panic kills you and us. Fear must become fuel, not paralysis." Achnacarry's training doctrine violated every principle of conventional military conditioning. Normal armies eliminate fear through routine, discipline, and predictability. Commandos were taught the opposite. Embrace chaos, operate when terrified, turn panic into surgical violence. The Death March exercise became legendary. 48 hours in the highlands with no food, one knife, and instructors hunting you with live ammunition. The objective wasn't survival. It was learning to think strategically when your body was screaming for food, sleep, and safety. German soldiers trained to follow orders under pressure. Commandos trained to improvise solutions when all orders had failed and pressure was absolute. The contrast with German training was deliberate. Wehrmacht soldiers were magnificent when following doctrine, executing plans, operating within established systems. But the Commandos were designed to operate where doctrine collapsed, where plans failed, where systems didn't exist. They were trained for the moment when everything goes wrong, and survival depends on improvised violence. Captain Peter Young, training officer, explained the philosophy. The German soldier is taught that his strength comes from the army, the system, the organization, the hierarchy. We're teaching our men that strength comes from themselves. When you're 12 men behind enemy lines and everything has gone to hell, you can't radio for orders. You must become the nightmare the enemy fears, or die trying. The psychological profile being created was specific. Men who function optimally under maximum stress, who view impossible situations as tactical opportunities, who can inflict sudden, overwhelming violence and then disappear into darkness without emotional collapse. By November 1940, the first commando units were ready. Not ready to fight, any soldier can fight. Ready to haunt. Ready to appear where defenses were strongest, kill with clinical precision, and vanish before German forces understood what had happened. Ready to teach the Wehrmacht that invincible was just a word that died when British knives found German throats in the darkness. March 4, 1941, Lofoten Islands, Norway. The nightmare becomes real. The German garrison on these remote fishing islands numbered approximately 1,100 soldiers. They were well-equipped, well-trained, stationed in a location so remote and strategically minor that attack seemed impossible. Berlin barely remembered these islands existed. The soldiers there felt safe, not just protected, but invisible to the war raging across Europe. At 6:45 hours, that safety died. 500 British commandos emerged from the pre-dawn darkness like materializing ghosts. No preliminary bombardment had warned the Germans. No patrol had detected approaching ships. One moment the garrison was sleeping or eating breakfast. The next moment, British soldiers were inside their buildings, weapons ready, moving with terrifying coordination. Lieutenant Klaus Fischer, captured during the raid, would later testify, "I was shaving when the door exploded inward. A British soldier stood there, he looked me in the eyes, and I understood I was already dead if he chose. He didn't choose. Instead, he zip-tied my hands and moved to the next room. It was surgical, emotionless, like being captured by machines that looked like men. The Commandos destroyed fish oil factories producing glycerin for German explosives, demolished harbor facilities, seized encryption equipment and documents, and captured 228 German prisoners, along with Quisling collaborators. But more importantly, they demonstrated something that shattered German psychological certainty. Nowhere was safe. The military gains were real, but secondary. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers across Norway suddenly understood that British forces could travel 200 miles through hostile waters, strike defended positions, and extract successfully. Every fishing village, every harbor, every remote garrison became a potential target. In Berlin, the reaction was rage mixed with disbelief. How had this happened? Göring demanded coastal defenses be strengthened immediately. Hitler ordered garrison forces doubled across Norway. Intelligence officers scrambled to understand how British forces had achieved such complete surprise. But the deeper damage was psychological. German soldiers in Norway began experiencing what medical officers would later term anticipation stress, the grinding psychological wear of defending against an enemy who might attack anytime, anywhere, or never. The uncertainty became a weapon more effective than artillery. Corporal MacDonald's diary, returning from Lofoten. "We killed Germans, yes, but more importantly, we killed their sense of safety. Every garrison soldier in Norway will now stare at the darkness wondering if tonight is when we come. That fear, that's the real weapon. We're not just raiders. We're the nightmare they can't wake from." The German military machine began adapting to the nightmare, and in adapting, revealed how deeply the Commandos had penetrated their psychology. Wehrmacht intelligence reports from spring 1941 show the psychological infection spreading. Commanders across occupied Europe demanded reinforcements, additional defenses, increased patrols, not because of imminent attack, but because the possibility of attack paralyzed strategic thinking. General der Infanterie Wilhelm Falkenhorst, commanding German forces in Norway, sent increasingly desperate communications to Berlin. The British commandos represent a threat beyond their numerical strength. My soldiers cannot maintain readiness indefinitely. Human psychology requires either combat or rest. The British provide neither, only perpetual uncertainty. I require 40,000 additional troops to adequately defend potential landing sites. This was the strategy's hidden genius. Germany deployed 40,000 soldiers to Norway, troops desperately needed in North Africa, or being held in reserve for the coming invasion of the Soviet Union, to defend against commandos who numbered perhaps 2,000 total. A 20.1 force multiplication achieved through psychology alone. But the adaptations revealed how deeply the nightmare had taken root. German defensive doctrine across occupied territories fundamentally changed. Instead of mobile reserves that could respond to actual attacks, forces were dispersed in static defensive positions, each garrison strong enough to resist commando raids but too scattered to concentrate for offensive operations. Captured German documents from this period reveal the psychological transformation. Before Lofoten, German military communications described occupation duties as rest postings, compared to combat fronts. After Lofoten, medical reports documented increasing nervous exhaustion, sleep disorders, and what one German psychiatrist described as chronic anticipatory fear syndrome. A particularly revealing report from a Wehrmacht medical officer in France, June 1941, soldiers stationed on coastal defense exhibit stress symptoms comparable to frontline combat troops, despite experiencing no actual combat. They are being psychologically depleted by defending against attacks that may never come. The British have weaponized waiting itself. Meanwhile, commando training evolved to exploit this psychological vulnerability. New tactics emphasized leaving evidence suggesting larger forces, extra boot prints, scattered equipment marked with different unit insignia, radio transmissions suggesting coordination between non-existent battalions. Make 12 men appear as 100. Force the enemy to prepare for threats that don't exist while you strike where they're not looking. The nightmare was becoming self-sustaining. German forces weren't just defending against actual commandos, they were defending against the idea of commandos, which was far more expensive. Fear of attack multiplied faster than actual attacks ever could. The Wehrmacht was learning that facing an enemy was preferable to fearing one that might never come. December 27, 1941. Vågsøy, Norway. The nightmare intensifies into its most perfectly executed demonstration. Operation Archery targeted the fishing town of South Vågsøy and the nearby island of Maløy. Intelligence suggested 150 German soldiers garrisoned the area. The commando force numbered 570 men, supported by naval bombardment and RAF cover. Unlike Lofoten, this raid was designed for sustained combat, not just surprise and extraction. The attack began at 8:48 hours with naval shellfire, but the commandos were already ashore, having landed under darkness 30 minutes earlier. German forces emerged from bunkers to face naval bombardment, only to discover British soldiers already behind them, inside their defensive positions, fighting from where defenders should have been. The combat lasted 6 hours of brutal close-quarters fighting. But the psychological operation was perfect. German reinforcements arrived from Maløy, only to find commandos had already mined the approaches. Artillery positions prepared to fire on landing beaches discovered British troops attacking them from inland directions. Every German tactical response was anticipated and countered, creating the psychological impression that the commandos knew German defensive plans better than the Germans themselves. Captain Peter Young's combat report captures the psychological warfare in action. We fought through the town systematically, clearing buildings while leaving specific evidence. German maps marked with our attack routes, suggesting intelligence penetration. Radio equipment damaged in ways suggesting we'd extracted information first. We wanted survivors to report not just that we attacked, but that we knew everything about their defenses before we arrived. The casualty ratio told a brutal story. 150 German soldiers killed or captured versus 17 British dead and 53 wounded. But more devastating was the psychological message. Even when Germans knew attack was coming, even with prepared defenses and numerical advantage in a fortified position, the Commandos won decisively. The aftermath rippled through German military psychology across Europe. If Vogtsøy, heavily defended, garrisoned with reinforcements available, could be overwhelmed in 6 hours, what hope did isolated positions have? The nightmare deepened from fear of surprise attack to fear that even prepared defense was futile. Hauptmann Klimt, captured at Vogtsøy, would later tell British interrogators, "We were Wehrmacht, professional soldiers, well-trained, well-led. You made us feel like civilians playing soldier. The speed, the precision, the certainty in your movements, it was like fighting people who knew they'd already won. That psychological advantage was more devastating than your weapons. You made us doubt ourselves before the first shot was fired." Spring, 1942. The nightmare spreads beyond Norway, metastasizing into strategic psychological warfare across occupied Europe. The Brunewald raid in February 1942 demonstrated the Commandos' evolution from raiders to intelligence operatives who fought. A British paratrooper unit, trained in commando tactics, assaulted a German radar installation on the French coast, disassembled critical components, captured the German radar technician, and extracted by sea. The operation lasted 4 hours. The intelligence gained on German radar technology proved invaluable for RAF bomber operations. But for German forces, Brunewald revealed something more terrifying. The British could identify high-value targets, plan precision operations against them, and extract with captured personnel and equipment. The implications were staggering. Every German scientist, every research facility, every technical installation in occupied Europe became a potential target. The German response was predictable and exactly what British strategy required. Increased security around research facilities, dispersal of sensitive programs, additional troops diverted to guard installations that Commandos might, or might not, target. Force multiplication through psychological pressure. Then came St. Nazaire in March 1942, the raid that transformed the nightmare into legend. HMS Campbelltown, an obsolete destroyer packed with delayed fuse explosives and disguised as a German vessel, rammed the gates of the only Atlantic dry dock capable of servicing the battleship Tirpitz. Commandos stormed ashore, destroyed dock facilities, fought through the town, and inflicted maximum damage before being killed or captured. Of 611 men who participated, 169 were killed and 200 captured. German forces celebrated repelling the failed raid. Officers congratulated themselves on capturing so many British soldiers. Engineers swarmed over the destroyed HMS Campbelltown, examining the wreck, while dozens of high-ranking officers visited to inspect the captured British destroyer. Then, 12 hours after the raid, 5 tons of explosives detonated. The blast killed 360 German naval personnel and destroyed the dry dock so completely it remained unusable for the war's duration. The Tirpitz lost its only Atlantic repair facility, effectively removing Germany's last super battleship from Atlantic operations. The psychological impact exceeded even the strategic gains. German forces across Europe suddenly understood British defeats might be delayed victories. Captured equipment might be bombs. Even winning battles against Commandos might be part of a deeper plan that wouldn't reveal itself until too late. The nightmare had evolved. Germans weren't just afraid of being attacked, they were afraid of their own victories, suspicious of their own success, doubting their own security even after repelling raids. The Commandos had weaponized paranoia itself. The human cost of becoming someone else's nightmare began manifesting in both armies, but in profoundly different ways. Among German garrison troops, Wehrmacht medical officers documented an epidemic of psychological disorders. Commando anxiety spread through coastal defenses like a disease. Soldiers who'd never encountered actual commandos exhibited symptoms: hypervigilance, sleep deprivation, violent overreaction to innocent stimuli, paranoid delusions about infiltration. One incident in France, May 1942, revealed the depth of psychological damage. A German coastal garrison fired on French fishermen at dawn, killing 11 civilians, because sentries hallucinated British infiltration. The Wehrmacht investigation found the guards had been on duty for 7 months without encountering a single commando raid, yet their psychological state suggested combat trauma equivalent to Eastern Front veterans. A German military psychiatrist's report from this period. "We face an enemy who kills through anticipation as effectively as through bullets. Soldiers defending against commandos experience sustained stress that conventional combat cannot create. In battle, fear has an object, the enemy before you. Against commandos, fear has no object except darkness itself, which never ends. The Wehrmacht's response, rotating coastal troops more frequently, providing psychological counseling, increasing leave allocations, only proved how deeply the nightmare had penetrated. Germany was diverting medical resources and personnel management to treat soldiers who'd never seen combat, damaged by fear alone. Meanwhile, British commandos confronted their own psychological costs. Men trained to be nightmares struggled with what that transformation required. Corporal MacDonald's diary entries from 1942 reveal the moral weight. "We killed 4 sentries last night in silence. Professional work. But afterward I caught myself arranging the bodies where morning patrols would find them positioned to create maximum shock. I wanted their friends to see them and feel terror. This is my job now, manufacturing trauma in other human beings. I'm effective at it. I don't know what that makes me." The commando chaplain's reports described soldiers confessing not to killing, which they accepted as necessary, but to enjoying the psychological power, the godlike ability to inflict fear on demand. Some commandos struggled with guilt, others struggled with the absence of guilt, wondering if becoming effective nightmares had cost them their humanity. Yet the strategic effectiveness was undeniable. By mid-1942, Germany deployed over 300,000 troops on coastal defense duties across occupied Europe, all because 4,000 commandos had proven that the Wehrmacht's vaunted defensive superiority was psychological illusion. The nightmare was working. But nightmares, once created, tend to haunt everyone, including those who created them. August 19, 1942. Dieppe. The nightmare meets its bloodiest reality and most paradoxical success. Operation Jubilee sent 6,000 troops, mostly Canadian infantry with commando support, against the fortified French port of Dieppe. The operation became catastrophic. 3,723 casualties, including 916 killed and 1,946 captured. German forces repelled the assault decisively, inflicting devastating losses on attacking forces trapped on beaches by prepared defenses. Yet within this disaster, the commando elements demonstrated why they'd become Germany's nightmare. Number 4. Commando, led by Lord Lovat, attacked the Hesse battery, 6 heavy guns dominating the landing beaches. While Canadian forces were slaughtered on Dieppe's beaches, Lovat's 252 commandos infiltrated 6 miles behind German lines, destroyed the battery with 0 friendly casualties, killed the gun crews, demolished the weapons, and withdrew successfully. Simultaneously, Number 3 Commando achieved similar success on the opposite flank. The psychological divergence was stark. Conventional forces attacking prepared positions suffered predictable, terrible losses. Commando units using infiltration, surprise, and psychological tactics succeeded completely. The lesson reshaped Allied strategy, but it also deepened the German nightmare. Wehrmacht analysis of Dieppe revealed unintended psychological victory for the Allies. Yes, German forces had won decisively, but the after-action reports obsessed over the commando successes. How did British forces penetrate 6 miles behind coastal defenses undetected? What intelligence allowed them to identify and destroy high-value targets while avoiding defensive strongpoints? Most concerningly, if Dieppe was a reconnaissance for future invasion, what did they learn that we don't know they learned? This became Dieppe's hidden psychological success. Instead of reducing coastal defense investments after their victory, Germany intensified them, convinced that Dieppe was preparation for larger invasion. The nightmare logic was perfect. Even defeating commandos made Germany more afraid, not less. General der Infantry Erich Marx, responsible for French coastal defenses, wrote in September 1942, "We defeated the Dieppe raid decisively, yet I cannot sleep soundly. The British sacrificed thousands of men to test specific defensive sectors. This suggests they're preparing an invasion large enough that reconnaissance costs are acceptable. We must strengthen every kilometer of coastline, but we lack forces to do so. The British have trapped us. We must defend everywhere, concentrate nowhere, and wait for an attack that could come anywhere or nowhere." The nightmare had achieved its ultimate form. Even German victories reinforced the psychological trap. The commandos had taught the Wehrmacht to fear its own success. The nightmare becomes strategic doctrine. spreading beyond British Commandos to reshape Allied special operations globally. American Rangers train at Aknakari, learning the same psychological warfare techniques. The 1st Ranger Battalion executes Operation Torch landings in North Africa with textbook commando precision, surprise assault, overwhelming initial violence, psychological dominance established before conventional forces arrive. The Rangers adopt not just tactics but philosophy, become the enemy's nightmare, not just their opponent. Soviet partisans behind German lines independently discover the same psychological mathematics. Small units attacking without warning, disappearing into populations, forcing enemy overreaction that alienates civilians. By 1943, Germany deploys 600,000 troops on anti-partisan duties in occupied Soviet territories. Troops desperately needed at Stalingrad or Kursk instead guard rear areas against nightmares that strike without pattern or mercy. The convergence reveals psychological warfare as universal military principle. Humans cannot defend everywhere simultaneously. Forces attempting to do so exhaust themselves through vigilance alone, even without combat. The cost of anticipating attack exceeds the cost of actual battle. German forces attempt counter-psychology, savage reprisals against civilians, collective punishment designed to make populations fear cooperation with commandos or partisans. But the strategy backfires. Brutality creates more resistance fighters, while demonstrating that Germany fears the invisible enemy. Each reprisal becomes psychological admission that the nightmare is winning. A captured SS report from France, July 1943, reveals the psychological collapse. Anti-partisan operations are militarily successful, but strategically futile. For every partisan killed, 2 more emerge. The population increasingly views German forces as occupiers rather than protectors. Most concerning, our soldiers exhibit signs of demoralization not from combat losses, but from the constant strain of defending against enemies they cannot predict or locate. The psychological advantage has shifted decisively to resistance forces. Meanwhile, commando training reaches new sophistication. Recruits learn not just combat skills but psychological operations, how to make 12 men appear as 50, how to plant evidence suggesting imminent major attacks that won't come, how to manipulate enemy psychology to force resource misallocation. One training exercise becomes legendary: infiltrate a facility, acquire intelligence, and escape while leaving evidence, forcing the enemy to triple defensive forces at that location, where commandos will never strike again. By late 1943, the nightmare has metastasized beyond any single unit or nation. It's become strategic philosophy: make the enemy fear everywhere, and therefore defend nowhere effectively. The commandos proved the concept. Now the entire Allied Special Operations apparatus weaponizes it against Germany across every occupied territory. Spring, 1944. The nightmare reaches its strategic culmination. Operation Fortitude and D-Day preparations. 3 years of commando raids have conditioned German forces to expect attack anywhere and concentrate nowhere. Now Allied deception exploits this trained paranoia systematically. Fake radio traffic suggests armies massing at Dover. Inflatable tanks create phantom divisions. Double agents feed German intelligence reports of massive forces preparing to invade Pas-de-Calais, the logical landing site, closest to England, shortest route to Germany. But the deepest deception is psychological. Years of commando raids have taught Germans that Allies specialize in surprise attacks at unexpected locations. Therefore, when invasion intelligence overwhelmingly points toward Pas-de-Calais, German analysts suspect deception, yet cannot dismiss the evidence. The nightmare has made Germans doubt their own intelligence, second-guess their own strategic reasoning. Actual commando units participate in pre-invasion raids designed to heighten confusion. Simultaneous strikes on Norwegian, Danish, and French positions in May 1944 suggest multiple invasion preparations. German forces respond by maintaining maximum defensive dispersal, exactly what Allied strategy requires. The nightmare has taught Germany to defend everywhere, making defense nowhere truly effective. June 6, 1944, 07:41 hours. The nightmare leads the invasion. Lord Lovett's No. 4 Commando lands at Sword Beach precisely on schedule, Piper Bill Millen playing Highland Laddie under German machine gun fire. The auditory psychology is deliberate. Defenders expecting desperate, chaotic invasion instead hear ceremonial music, suggesting confidence and control. It destabilizes rational response at the critical moment. At Point du Hoc, 225 U.S. Rangers scale 100-foot cliffs under fire to destroy artillery threatening Omaha Beach. The guns have been moved, but the psychological impact is devastating. German commanders receiving reports of Americans climbing sheer cliffs while being shot conclude Allied forces are beyond rational military calculation. The shock delays coordinated counterattack by crucial hours. The strategic revelation. 3 years of weaponized nightmare have conditioned German forces to respond with paralysis, rather than coordinated defense. When the actual invasion comes, Wehrmacht commanders initially treat it as another large raid, delaying recognition of the true scope. By the time German high command realizes this is the main assault, Allied forces have secured beachheads. Corporal MacDonald, landing at Sword Beach. We'd spent 3 years teaching them to fear surprise. Today we came exactly where intelligence suggested, and they still couldn't believe it. We'd made them doubt everything, including the truth. That's what nightmares do. They make you question reality itself. Summer 1944. The nightmare achieves its strategic purpose and reveals its human cost. As Allied forces push through France, they encounter German soldiers exhibiting profound psychological damage. Wehrmacht troops who'd spent years defending against Commandos struggle to transition to mobile defense or counterattack. They've internalized bunker mentality so deeply that aggressive maneuver becomes psychologically impossible. A captured German Oberst interviewed in August 1944 articulates the psychological defeat. You trained us to see threats everywhere. For 3 years we defended against attackers who came from darkness without warning. We learned to trust nothing, suspect everything, fear the unexpected. Then you expected us to attack, to move aggressively, to seize initiative. We'd forgotten how. We'd spent so long being hunted that we couldn't remember how to hunt. You didn't just defeat us militarily. You reprogrammed our psychology until we could only react, never initiate. This is the climax. The realization that the Commandos didn't just win battles. They fundamentally altered German military psychology, transforming the Wehrmacht from an aggressive offensive force into a defensive-minded army, paralyzed by anticipation of attacks from every direction. The force multiplication numbers are staggering. 15,000 Commandos, never more than 4,000 active simultaneously, tied down 450,000 German troops in defensive postures, forced infrastructure investments exceeding $2 billion, and psychologically damaged German combat effectiveness across all theaters. The nightmare achieved approximately 30.1 strategic multiplication, but the human cost manifests in both armies. Post-war psychological studies reveal that German coastal defense troops exhibit PTSD rates comparable to Eastern Front veterans, despite experiencing far less actual combat. They're casualties of sustained psychological warfare, damaged not by bullets but by years of anticipating violence that often never came. Among British commandos, the reckoning is equally profound. Men trained to be nightmares struggle to stop being nightmares. Corporal MacDonald's diary, May 1945. We won. Germany surrendered. Everyone celebrates. But I stand among them feeling nothing. I spent 4 years learning to move through darkness, to kill silently, to weaponize fear. That training doesn't have an off switch. I'm not sure the person I was before Aknakari still exists. We became the nightmare so effectively that we can't stop being it. That's the cost no one calculated. Transforming men into weapons that can't be safely decommissioned when the war ends. The nightmare worked. But nightmares once created haunt everyone, including those who conjured them. Decades later, military historians study the British Commandos with clinical precision, force multiplication ratios, tactical innovations, strategic impact analyses. But these metrics miss the deeper truth. The Commandos became Germany's nightmare not through superior firepower or numbers, but by fundamentally understanding that the human mind is the ultimate battlefield. The strategic mathematics are undeniable. 15,000 Commandos transformed World War II by forcing Germany to permanently deploy 450,000 soldiers in defensive postures, divert massive resources to coastal fortifications, and psychologically condition their forces into reactive paralysis. When D-Day arrived, German troops had been so thoroughly trained to fear unpredictable commando attacks that they struggled to mount effective, coordinated defense against the actual invasion. The tactical innovation spread globally. Soviet Spetsnaz, American Special Forces, Israeli Sayeret Matkal, SS descendants, Every modern elite unit incorporates psychological warfare principles pioneered at Aknakari, the understanding that small forces, properly trained in becoming psychological nightmares, can paralyze larger conventional armies through weaponized unpredictability. But visit veterans' hospitals in Britain, Germany, France today, and you'll find elderly men who still wake at night, decades after last seeing combat. Former commandos who carried their nightmare training into civilian life, struggling with relationships because they'd spent formative years learning to weaponize human psychology. Former German defenders who never fully recovered from years of defending against attacks that often never materialized. Modern special forces training includes psychological support systems that didn't exist in 1940. Today's military psychologists recognize what Lieutenant Colonel Vaughn intuited. Soldiers trained to become nightmares require structured support managing that transformation when warfare ends. The weapon must be carefully stored after deployment. Corporal Thomas MacDonald lived until 2003. His wartime diaries, donated to the Imperial War Museum after his death, end with an entry from 1946. I returned from war knowing something civilians cannot comprehend: how to make strong men afraid, how to move through darkness as predator, how to weaponize fear more effectively than any bullet or bomb. This knowledge doesn't make me proud. It makes me careful, because I also know that men trained to be nightmares don't stop being nightmares just because the war ended. We won decisively, but we paid in pieces of ourselves that peace cannot restore. The British Commandos became the nightmare of the German army through calculated psychological warfare. What they discovered was that becoming someone else's nightmare transforms you permanently, and that transformation costs everything. Those who weaponize fear carry that burden forever. If this story made you reflect on the hidden costs of psychological warfare, remember, nightmares don't end when you wake. They end when you stop being able to tell the difference between sleep and waking.